it's either deliberate escalation or it's an accident. We're quite used to the Russian Air Force being sloppy and unprofessional in the presence of NATO units. We've had a collision, and we'll just wait and see what happened. I heard just now that the Su-27 actually ended up in the Black Sea as well, so they may have lost the pilot. That suggests it's accidental rather than deliberate. If you're going to shoot it down, you're going to use a missile or your guns. But the trouble is, when you have people mucking around in international airspace like this, this sort of incident happens and tragedies occur, and I'm afraid escalation tends to be on the agenda.
Okay, we'll be watching that one, of course, won't we? And as for the deal yesterday, the deal between America, the United States and Australia, the AUKUS Pact, to produce a new generation of nuclear submarines for use in other ways, among other places in the Pacific theatre. Is that a big step forward? Are you very encouraged by that agreement?
John, it's a great statement about how we feel about the assertiveness and aggression of China under its current regime. Since Xi Jinping's been in power, he's been talking about controlling everything under heaven by 2049. There's been an expansive push into the East and South China Seas. We've seen pressure put on Taiwan, Japan, India, and other countries, free countries out in the Indo-Pacific. And what I've said to people this week is, nuclear submarines are the capital ships of modern navies. They project power in a way in which no other platform does. And of course, they operate in a stealth environment. And given the vast distances that have to be covered out in the Indo-Pacific, nuclear submarines, with their speed, their ability to remain silent, and their firepower, are absolutely essential in deterring aggression and resisting coercion.
Yeah, I say again, and I say often because it's true, that I'm a complete layman when it comes to matters military, when it concerns tactics and strategy.
You're better than that.
well, but we've been talking a lot, haven't we, in recent times about battle tanks, which was a piece of equipment that had seemed, from some points of view, to have outlived its usefulness, or at least to be in the dying days. And now we look at Ukraine and we see things quite differently. In the modern age now, tell me a bit more about the role of the submarine in modern warfare in this century.
Yeah, just on that, John, I would say that what has happened is we haven't seen a big tank battle yet in Ukraine. And one thing we have learned from Ukraine is it doesn't take a tank to kill a tank. We've seen the prospect, really, of heavily armoured French knights being mown down by longbows here. So, the tank's going to have a role in future, but it's not going to be the role it's had in the past. And many platforms are going to be revised as a result of, A, the 20th century, and secondly, the experience in Ukraine. And what I've said is, Ukraine is the last war of the 20th century in the way it's being fought, not the first war of the 21st. So sorry about the preamble.
Sure.
But submarines, as we know, submarines operate effectively in what is a stealth environment. They were just submersibles, really, during the First World War and well into the Second World War, in fact. But since the Second World War, we've had both conventional submarines, which are normally powered by diesel electric motors, and we've got nuclear submarines. And nuclear submarines are driven by a reactor. They're fast. They can cover vast distances. And also, of course, they can remain undetected for as long as the food lasts. It's as simple as that. One of the key things about the Falklands War 40 years ago is if you look at the Argentinian lessons document right at the top, it says British nuclear submarines were a threat with which the Argentine Navy could not cope. Simple as that. Yes. As soon as Belgrano was sunk, the rest of the Navy said, you know what, we don't want to take on the British nuclear submarines.
Yes.
And that remains the case. They are nasty beasts. And with their firepower, as I said, their agility, and we have to accept that British and American submarines, nuclear submarines, are the best in the world. They're silent, they're very, very efficient, and they've got formidable firepower.
Yes. I mean, we're all familiar with the idea of a submarine as a platform for launching missiles of varying destructive power. And of course, more conventional marine warfare, submarine can engage a warship or another submarine. We know that too. But there's also a concern now, maybe a more modern concern, Chris, isn't there, with the idea of using submarines in the warfare that involves strategically important but soft targets. I'm thinking of undersea communications cables or power cables.
That's a very good point, John. You know, the Russians have a whole department running about 8 specialist submarines that go after cables, they go after seabed arrays, and also against pipelines. And, you know, they must be prime suspect for the Nord Stream attack recently. The Americans have a submarine, the Jimmy Carter. It does exactly the same thing, but it was miles away at the time, so it wasn't that. I think you're going to see this more and more. What I think will happen with the AUKUS submarines is they will be essentially motherships that have a lot of unmanned systems on them, which they deploy, and they'll have a lot of other vertically launched weapons, which will vastly expand the range of what submarines can do. One of the things I've been saying recently in some of my presentations is what we don't realize is everything and everyone on this planet will be detectable on the surface of the planet probably in about 5 years' time. So being
Yes.
underground or underwater is going to be absolutely critical. But it's going to become more challenging because we're going to get lots of unmanned drones going around looking for submarines. And in some cases, the submarines, the first time they know about it is when it clangs on their hull.
Yes.
So
Yes.
it's a really dynamic environment. I have to tell you, John, I'm the only person since 1945 to sunk a submarine. So they don't like me very much.
You know, if I could draw you a little further into that reminiscence, tell me a bit more.
Okay, so the Argentinians sent a submarine to South Georgia at the start of the Falklands War, and we worked out where he was going to be, and we put 2 depth charges on him just as he was about to dive, and he beached himself in South Georgia just before we captured the island.
Really, well, there's not many people can recount a story like that, Chris. And just a last word on the war in Ukraine. I know you follow closely what's going on the land as well as in the sea, and the battle for Bakhmut rages on. It's a dreadfully grim conflict with heavy losses, you know, engaged on both sides. And I was reading a highly respected strategic war studies academic just over the last day or so, saying that this was ultimately, in his judgment, ultimately about just the two sides exhausting each other. The city, the town has such limited strategic value, but to Ukraine, it helps them simply kill more Russians than Russians are killing Ukrainians. And in that way, wearing down their strength, their physical strength, and their morale ahead of the day, the all-important day when Ukraine launches its big counteroffensive. Is that your reading too?
Yeah, there's no doubt that Bakhmut is being seen very much like Verdun in the First World War. The Germans hoped to bleed the French army to death by continually throwing troops into Verdun. In fact, the Germans ended up being on the wrong end of that particular exchange in terms of blood count. The issue is that the front has stabilized. The Russians have basically dug into trench and fortified systems all the way along the line of those 4 provinces that you and I know are on the map. The Ukrainians aren't ready for a counterattack yet, and I think they lack the mass before these tanks arrive with their train crews and things like that. The Russian Air Force, of course, operates behind its own lines very much. It never strays across. We've got a real stalemate here. I'm concerned that the Russian defensive systems are going to be too strong for a Ukrainian counterattack. But what is happening is the Russians are throwing corpses, to quote Marshal Zhukov's dictum from World War II, at Bakhmut. They're throwing in their Wagner group, they're throwing in their criminals, and they're throwing in also these mobilized troops. As soon as the Ukrainians show themselves, then the specialized attack groups are going in to deal with the Ukrainians. So the Ukrainians got to be very careful they don't get sucked into this. Just enough to, what we say in military terms, you want to do just enough to fix the enemy so you can bring him under fire from artillery and missiles. And it's a bit of a sort of a poker game at the moment, but you're right. The trouble is the Ukrainians haven't got the people to spare. The Russians do.
Yeah, it is as I say, a dark and grim thought. Chris, great to get your thoughts this afternoon. That's Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry, former NATO commander, in our briefing room with us this evening.